The desert air hung heavy and still, pressing against the rows of tents like a physical weight. Dust motes danced in the stagnant heat, undisturbed by any breeze. Within the encampment, the rhythm of life was dictated by the tabernacle, a constant cycle of ritual and duty. Korah stood at the edge of his own dwelling, his eyes fixed on the center of the camp. He watched the movements near the sacred entrance, specifically tracking the figure of Aaron. Every gesture Aaron made, every task he performed, felt like a sharp stone in Korah's palm. The Levite shifted his weight, his heels digging into the dry, cracked earth. He had spent years in service, yet the sight of the priesthood held by another now soured his breath. He turned away, but the image remained burned into his mind. He walked toward the perimeter, his pace measured, his jaw tight. The silence of the wilderness was no longer a sanctuary. It was a vacuum waiting to be filled by his ambition. He stopped by a cluster of rocks and looked back at the tabernacle one last time. The seed of envy had taken root, deep and jagged. He looked only at the power he believed was rightfully his. The decision formed in the quiet, a slow, deliberate hardening of his resolve. Korah did not wait for the sun to set. He moved between the tents, his shadow long and thin against the parched ground. He found Dathan and Abiram near the edge of the camp, their backs turned to the tabernacle. He spoke in low, jagged bursts, his words cutting through the heat. They listened, their faces hardening as he gestured toward the center of the assembly. The three men moved together, stopping at the tents of influential leaders, one by one. Each stop added another voice to the growing murmur. By the time the shadows stretched across the sand, 250 men had gathered in the dim space. They stood in a tight, restless knot, their hands gripping the fabric of their tents or resting on the hilts of their tools. Korah stood at the front, his posture rigid, his gaze no longer hidden. The private whispers had become a collective hum of resentment. He signaled, and the group turned as one, their boots crunching in unison against the dry earth. They marched toward the tent of Moses, a wall of bodies cutting through the camp. Korah stepped forward, his finger extended, his voice sharp and loud enough to draw the attention of every nearby family. He stood his ground, waiting for the leader to look up. Korah did not stop his tirade. His accusations hung in the air, sharp and demanding. The 250 men behind him shifted, their murmurs rising like a tide. They pointed toward the tabernacle, then back at the leader standing before them. They waited for a shout, a defense, or a command to strike back. Instead, Moses did nothing. He did not tighten his grip on his staff. He did not raise his voice to match their volume. He stood still, his gaze fixed on the ground, then slowly lowered himself. He let his knees hit the hard, dry earth. He leaned forward until his forehead pressed into the dust. The silence that followed was sudden and absolute, stripping the power from the rebel's words. After a long moment, he pushed himself up. "In the morning," he said, his voice steady and low, "the Lord will reveal who is truly his." He pointed toward the altar. "Bring your censers, fill them with fire, add the incense. Stand before the altar tomorrow, and wait." The sun rose over the desert, but it brought no warmth to the camp. It brought a heavy, suffocating stillness. Korah, Dathan, and Abiram emerged from their tents, their bronze censers clutched in their hands. They walked toward the tabernacle, their footsteps muffled by the thick, expectant silence of thousands of witnesses. The 250 leaders followed, a line of men moving toward the altar. They stopped. They stood in a row, their faces set in defiance. Then, the air itself changed. A low hum vibrated through the soles of their feet. The sky above the tabernacle peeled back, and the glory of the Lord descended. It was not a flicker, but a blinding, consuming light that slammed into the earth. The rebels stumbled back, their eyes shielded by their arms. Moses stood at the edge of the radiance, his silhouette sharp against the brilliance. He turned to the people, his voice cutting through the roar of the light. "Move away from the tents of these wicked men. Do not touch anything that belongs to them, or you will be swept away by their sin." Dathan and Abiram did not move. They stood at the flaps of their tents, their arms crossed, their faces locked in a mask of stubborn pride. Their families clustered behind them, eyes wide, watching the crowd retreat. Moses turned his back on the tabernacle and faced the horizon. He raised his hand, his voice carrying across the empty space. "If these men die a natural death, the Lord has not sent me," he declared. "But if the earth opens its mouth and swallows them, then you will know." The air went thin. A low, grinding vibration started deep beneath the surface, rattling the teeth of everyone who heard it. The ground groaned, a sound of stone shearing against stone. Then, the earth buckled. A jagged fissure tore through the camp. With a roar like a collapsing mountain, the earth surged upward, then vanished into a yawning abyss. Korah and his household fell into the dark. The ground slammed shut behind them, sealing the gap with a final thud. Where the tents had stood, there was only flat, undisturbed sand. The silence did not last. It was a fragile thing, shattered in a heartbeat. The 250 men who had stood with Korah remained, their bronze censers still held high. They looked at the empty space where their leaders had been, then toward the altar, and finally at each other. The defiance in their eyes flickered, replaced by a sudden, cold clarity. They turned to run, but the air above the altar ignited. It was not a natural flame. It was a searing, white-hot torrent that poured from the presence of the Lord. The fire did not spread. It struck with surgical precision. It descended like a hammer, engulfing the men in a single, roaring wave of heat. There was no time for a cry. The air hissed as it superheated, and the ground beneath them turned to ash. The men vanished into the brilliance, their forms consumed by the intensity of the judgment. The fire surged, licked the air, and then abruptly died, leaving the camp in a sudden, blinding darkness. Where the rebels had stood, only the faint, glowing outlines of their bronze censers remained, scattered across the scorched earth. The rebellion was gone. The smoke cleared, leaving the air thin and metallic. Men stepped forward, their boots crunching on the brittle, scorched earth. They reached the center of the clearing where the fire had struck. Scattered across the blackened ground lay the 250 bronze censers. They were distorted, warped by the heat. Yet, they remained intact. No one spoke. The weight of the moment pressed down on the assembly. Under the direction of the leaders, workers gathered the bronze. They hauled the heavy, cooling metal to the edge of the tabernacle. The sound of hammers began to ring out, a rhythmic, sharp clanging that echoed across the plains. Each strike flattened the bronze, turning the tools of rebellion into thin, wide sheets. The metal groaned under the force of the blows, slowly losing its original shape. Once the sheets were prepared, they were carried to the altar. They were bolted into place, one by one, until the sides were encased. It was a permanent, visual testament. Every time the priests approached, they would see the bronze, a cold reminder of the cost of pride. The dust settled, but a strange ripple moved through the ranks of the people. It was not a sound of mourning, but a whisper of disbelief. Word passed from tent to tent, traveling faster than the wind. The abyss had claimed the rebels, yet the line of Korah had not been erased. Men searched the perimeter of the camp, looking for those who had been marked for judgment. They found them standing at the edge of the tabernacle court, away from the site of the collapse. The sons of Korah remained. They had not joined their father at the tent flaps. They had not stood with the 250. When the ground groaned and the fire fell, they were already elsewhere, their faces turned toward the holy place. The leaders approached them, expecting to find the same defiance that had fueled the rebellion. Instead, they found a stillness that mirrored the sanctuary itself. The sons of Korah did not look back at the abyss. They did not reach for the bronze or the incense of the past. They stood with their hands empty, their eyes fixed on the entrance of the tent of meeting. They had seen the cost of pride, and in that moment of absolute clarity, they chose a different path. Time moved forward, washing over the site of the judgment like a slow, steady tide. The memory of the abyss faded into the bedrock of history, but the line of Korah endured. Decades passed, then centuries. The sons of the rebel did not carry the weight of their father's defiance. Instead, they carried the memory of the mercy that had spared them. Within the stone walls of the temple, a new sound began to rise. It was not the sharp, angry tone of accusation, but the resonant, melodic swell of worship. The descendants of Korah took up the instruments of the sanctuary. They stood before the congregation, their voices lifting in unison to fill the air with psalms. They wrote of the wilderness, of the dust, and of the God who reaches into the darkest places to pull out a song of redemption. Where their father had sown seeds of destruction, they harvested melodies of praise. The temple echoed with their music, a living testament that a family history does not dictate the future. Pride had once threatened to tear everything down, but mercy had raised a new song from the ashes. The cycle of rebellion was broken, replaced by a legacy of devotion that would ring through the ages. The past was silent, but the future was singing.